I'm really looking forward to this panel, and I'm very privileged actually to be joined by two of my really good friends, Therese and Dan, and I've had the privilege of working with both of them over a number of years. Therese and I go back quite some way before I had gray hair. And Dan and I have been enjoying working with each other over the course of the last 2-3 years. So really nice to have you guys with us today.
Thanks for the invite.
No, it's a pleasure. So, I mean, the real objective of this panel is to kind of have if we were sitting on a fireside, we'd be having a fireside chat about ESG and all things EHS. And the three of us have got a long history in the space. And so I'm very fortunate to have you both here today. Maybe just to kind of give some context to my panelists, Therese Nicholson is the head of sustainability at 91, which is a top 50 global asset manager. It's a business that is overseeing, well over $150 billion, I think it is, of client capital, working in a number of countries around the world and working with some of the largest funds in the world. So Therese is responsible for really overseeing a program and a policy that has been kind of steeped in ESG. And Dan joins us from ADEC Innovations. Dan has an illustrious career working in the social impact space, as well as in the EHS and ESG space. More recently, he was appointed as Managing Director at ADEC Innovations and brings with him a wealth of experience in that space. So thank you both for joining me today. Cool. So I thought maybe just to kind of dive off, I'm going to start with Therese because the kind of framing of this panel is really around ESG and then EHS. And for many of our attendees and for many of the people that are going to be listening to these recorded videos in time, ESG is emerging as something that they're aware of, but probably is quite new. So I thought, I'll be doing a presentation later today. Therese, I thought it'd be really interesting just to kind of hear from you as to kind of like why you think ESG has become so key to investors as opposed to maybe 10 years ago when it was around, but just didn't seem to be such a big driving factor.
Yeah, thank you, Malcolm. And it's so good to be here. And you and I have been obviously on this journey together for a large part of this development. But I think the way to sort of introduce ESG or sustainability is really just to look a little bit at not just how it's grown as a concept, but also how it's evolved. So it's been around for a long time, the concept around integrating or focusing on sustainability related issues. But the way that it was addressed by investors has changed over time. So if we go back about 2 decades, this was very much about SRI funds, so socially responsible funds, which were mostly focused on exclusions and some form of set of values, basically. It wasn't as much steeped in this idea that this was something that could enhance your risk return profile of your portfolios. Obviously, this changed a bit as we went into the financial crisis. After that, we got this concept of stewardship sort of placed in the industry, which was obviously trying to rectify the fact that there was a view that investors had sort of been asleep at the wheel, if you like, before and through the financial crisis, which was part of the reason that we didn't understand or deal with risk as well as we should. So after that, the concept of ESG was sort of coined properly in the market. So what we're saying that is that we argue that by considering the full set of ESG risks and opportunities, we can create better risk-adjusted returns on behalf of our clients. Looking at the size of assets that are now invested in an ESG integrated way, it's really quite impressive. I mean, you can measure it in quite different ways. So the numbers do vary a bit, but there are a couple of indicators we could consider. So there's something called the Principles for Responsible Investments, which it was set up to sort of coin the term ESG back in 2006 or so, I think, Malcolm, if I'm not mistaken. And that today has 4,000 signatories from around the world, which is 110 trillion US dollars. Now, what that means is all of these signatories have committed to integrating ESG issues. I mean, obviously, that doesn't mean that every single product is looking at this in the same way, but it's giving you an indication of the size of this movement. Another figure was given by Bloomberg, which is suggesting, or they think that by 2025, we'll have about a third of global assets under management across asset classes focusing on ESG. And the drivers behind this is a couple. First of all, there's clearly been a set of regulations and expectations in the market in the form of stewardship codes, etc., as I alluded to. The demand from clients has increased as well. That's partially, I think, as asset owners have evolved their thinking around fiduciary duty. So what is in the interest of their members, which clearly, you know, investing in activities that is somehow creating negative externalities not in the interest of their members. And then also as long-term savers, they're obviously impacted by the cost that comes from not managing negative externalities. And then I would also say that the world is changing. You know, just in the last 2 decades, we've moved into what's considered a new epoch. It's called the Anthropocene, which is basically saying that the way that we've grown in the past through what is a very stable period is no longer the case. Now we basically have us as humanity that is the dominant influence on the environment and climate. That means that obviously this presents a big opportunity in terms of active management, in terms of trying to find alpha, because theoretically we're now dealing with what could be, you know, the biggest mispricing in the market that we've ever seen by sort of ignoring these kinds of issues. And the final point as well, I think a driver behind it is that the governments around the world can't actually deal with the sustainability challenge in and of themselves. You know, there isn't enough money or, you know, to go around to just sort of deal and pay for these externalities, which is why the entire value chain has to be coordinated and incentivized to try and deal with this. So those are just a couple of nuggets behind what has been the driver behind what is now a massive movement.
Awesome, thanks, Therese. That's much appreciated. I think that's a really good segue into Dan, maybe just getting some of your reflections, because as ESG is starting to drive down, a lot of your customers are the kind of listed companies and big brands that are being affected by this. So I'd be quite interested to hear your thoughts as to how you see this starting to reflect into your space and where you see the sort of pinch points starting to emerge.
Thanks, Malcolm, and just to reiterate, thank you for inviting us and for the promotion. By the way, I'm so managing director of just the technology division, not all of ADEC Innovation, but I'll take that. Thank you. I think as you said, I mean, I've worked in this space being ESG, and I'm always slightly hesitant to use sort of ESG in the space of so many different sort of framings of that, but specifically for our clients at ADEC Innovation, as an organization, we've been providing solutions focused on advancing sustainability practices for nearly 40 years. So whilst it's new in certain areas, it's certainly been very much apparent for our clients for a long time. And I guess the focus has changed, and a lot of that's, as Therese has just explained, it has come from sort of the financial side, financial sector, and perhaps prior to that, the driver was coming more from NGO pressure, some fairly high profile scandals, whether that was the Detox Live by Greenpeace or sort of terrible disasters like Rana Plaza in Bangladesh. So I think that the brands that we work with have always had an emphasis to a degree on the program. And I think the focus for them has really been on the value chain. So it is the supply chain, and beyond just what's going on in their own organizations, how they transfer that into the value chain. The majority of our clients are global organizations. They have, from some of them tens of thousands of suppliers interacting with their businesses. So they're having to manage both the sort of a global perspective, but also understanding the localized nuances of their supply chains, and they're looking to work with partners who can reflect some of those those challenges. I mean, I guess more holistically, I think we've seen in our space there's a big shift from this being a nice to have to a need to have. Again, driven by financial markets and stakeholders, but also from legislation. There is a increasing amount of legislation coming into the space, which you have seen direct impacts of things like the Modern Day Slavery Act on businesses having to make commitments against the position that they're taking. So, rather than it being a footnote on an annual report, it's now a whole section of an annual report. These are important matters that are being taken very seriously at board level, and the implications of getting it wrong are very significant as well. And we've seen, organisations who have perhaps not done it quite as they intended, and severe impact on their share price. So it's an increasing focus for them. And I think certainly that the forward-thinking clients or sort of organisations who I tend to hopefully think a lot of those are working with us are making sure that they're embedding this practice into their general ways of working. So it stems right from top down across all of their businesses, and they need solutions that can help them to simplify what is an incredibly complex landscape, and one that is consistently evolving. So I think those are certainly some of the sort of insights I would say from the market that we're working in.
Awesome. No, thanks, Dan. It's interesting. I think a lot of the people that will be on the calls today and on the call or watching the videos in the future will be coming out of a sort of an EHS practice sort of framework, which in many ways has been around for quite a long time. Therese, I'd be quite interested the environment piece seems to map relatively sort of cleanly. The social and the governance pieces don't map as obviously. I mean, there are clear overlaps, and we'll speak to that maybe a little bit later as well in the program. But I'd be interested firstly on your reflections in terms of the kind of environmental piece, but also more importantly, I'd be interested to know what your thoughts are around how sort of social and governance factors map to a lot of the metrics that are coming up from a traditional EHS perspective. Because our sort of typical customers are actually, I think they're the generators of the data that allows ESG to be reflected. But I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. I think it's completely fair to say that issues that fall under the social pillar, the S pillar, has sort of been behind the E pillar for a very long time. Partially, I think that is because it's been easier to put a price on the environmental issues or the externalities that investors have been facing. So for that reason, it's been slightly more quantifiable to sort of deal with from an investment and sort of materiality perspective. Yes, I mean, there are certain sectors, and South Africa will be very close to this in terms of the mining activities, and we know what it costs, for example, to have a mine shut down for a certain period of time, rooted in, for example, a social or human capital labor type of issue. But I think what's more difficult to assess is things like culture and what makes a workforce really productive, etc. And these are all issues that I think we all agree are important, and particularly coming out of a period like COVID, where obviously companies have been put to the test with respect to their commitments to their workforce. How are they actually following through with what has been policies and commitments over the years? And I think we're still to see the actual impact and the competition between companies in terms of, how sticky their workforce has been through this time. But I think this, there's another way to look at it, and it's the way that it's been approached from a regulatory perspective as well. I mean, there's a reason we've started with an environmental taxonomy, for example, in the market, which is, it's easier to link a revenue stream to an environmental activity, whereas when we look at this from a social perspective, it's harder to always find a social revenue stream, but it doesn't mean that there isn't social outputs or measurable social change that you could assess that you could argue therefore should be considered from a sort of social impact perspective. And I think that's the reason why we're grappling with that taxonomy second-handedly. When it comes to government governance, obviously you can look at it through the perspective of pretty traditional corporate governance assessments, but ultimately in terms of board structures and shareholder rights, etc. But ultimately what it all comes down to is that corporate governance is all about leadership and risk management systems. And theoretically, your environmental and your social performance, the way that you manage that, the systems you have in place, all flow from what type of governance that you have in place. And to this space of sustainability and ESG, I think it's increasingly recognized that there is a need, generally speaking, across the market for a new sort of management paradigm for corporate leaders to try and, to ensure that basically these considerations, including the complex relationship with social aspects, is embedded not just in operations, but also strategy of companies.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. I think what we're seeing a lot of is that, in 2021, we've got increasing availability of data, we've got increasing availability of information, and maybe in some cases almost too much, but it's how that kind of gets pulled into an organization so that strategic decisions can be made, but also so that transparency can be created in terms of how external stakeholders can perceive things. So it's trying to map these things, and a lot of the data in reality is coming out of the functions that are traditionally sitting within the sort of EHS space. So in a weird way, I sort of think for many, many years, EHS professionals were kind of not really loved enough. And we're now starting to see the core value that these people are sort of bringing into an organization that actually in many ways speaks into both the risk paradigm, but also the opportunity paradigm that is so important for companies as they reflect outwards. Dan, I know that within the space that you guys operate, particularly within the clean chain framework, there's a very strong environmental component with the chemicals module. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts around how that becomes such a critical component, but I'm also quite interested to hear maybe a little bit about your reflections from your previous kind of careers in the social space, and how you think social starts to feed up into this sort of ESG framework from where, the way it was historically looked at through the old NGO lens, I guess, to some extent.
Yeah, I as you say, Malcolm, I've come from spending sort of 7 years very heavily focused in the social side, and that was a very big influence on the organizations that I was working at. Probably mostly actually that for the previous 5 years, certainly actually social took a priority, in my opinion, over the environmental challenges. And I think goes back to something I said earlier. I think that was very much driven by the need to meet certain legislatively pushed. So the Modern Day Slavery Act in the UK and the equivalent in Australia really made businesses have to focus in on those sort of areas. But I think there's always been a correlation between the social and environment anyway, because the air that we breathe, the water that we drink, all have social impacts on communities as well as the workforce themselves, and obviously that ties very closely to the health and safety aspect as well. So I think certainly at Clean Chain, we were the product was born out of a report that Greenpeace produced around the need to detox water streams. There was a lot of publicity around that and the high levels of pollutants that were going into water and air from the big apparel brands. And what we saw was the collaboration of those brands together to form solutions. So outside of governments, that's actually organizations getting together. And that led to the formation of ZDHC, Zero Discharge of Hazardous Chemicals, which is a multi-stakeholder contributor-driven organization made up of many of the largest textile brands. And once they've developed the standard tools were needed to help organizations actually meet those standards, and that's where Clean Chain came in. So what we're seeing now, certainly driven, I think, partially by the SDGs and organisations committing to certain ones around there. Also a very heavy focus on international governments on environmental issues, that those organisations who perhaps traditionally had been focused on social are having to shift and pivot towards making sure that they're capturing environmental data. And that certainly seems to be the trend, but there is this desire to try and knit the two together, environmental and social. So if you're in a factory finding out about what their what's their chemical inventory and making sure that that's meeting restricted substance lists, etc., is what other aspects are in that facility that you could collect. So our customers are looking to see what data have they got that can be used across both pillars, and I think that's going to be quite key in terms of our customers, in respect of being able to utilize that data for both social and environmental.
Awesome. Yeah, that's really insightful. I think we often try and silo things, and so we think of environment and health and safety and governance in all these separate buckets, but the reality is they're all interconnected. And I think your point about social and environmental is very, very, very true, both from a community impact perspective and a workforce. But Teresa's point around culture is that if you have the right culture in an organization, the right awareness, you probably behave in a different way, which means that you limit both your social and your environmental risks as well. So yeah, great points, guys. Teresa, given what you've been doing at 91 over the past 10 years or so, and I did have to pause when I realized it's been 10 years or so since you joined. It's almost 10 years this year, I think, since you joined 91. So congratulations. If you think about it through the lens of the things that would be important to this audience, what do you think are the kind of like key issues that EHS professionals should be thinking about in this new ESG dominated paradigm that we're now moving into, in terms of how they can maybe emphasize on certain things or elevate certain bits of what they're doing into the organization, which will help their companies and their kind of leadership reflect better in terms of ESG?
Yeah, and Malcolm, I think Dan actually touched on it there with his point about how we're not looking at these things in silo anymore. I mean, from my perspective, that is one of the things that has changed quite dramatically in terms of the conversation that is going on, not just between investors and companies, but also I think between the regulatory space and what's expected in the market, particularly with respect to products that are, focusing on solutions. So, I mean, I would even go as far as saying the interaction we've had around ESG, the conversation between stakeholders on ESG is not going to be the same, in my opinion, for the next 20 years as it's been for the past 20 years. There's big transformation going on within the industry, even just within our organization. Malcolm, you remember we were set up as an ESG team, and we don't have that anymore. Conceptually, ESG is what the investment teams do, and instead we have, the concept of sustainability as an ecosystem that you think about. So, I mean, there are a couple of things that I would say is kind of on the horizon. Obviously, we're going through the eye of the storm with respect to climate change at the moment. That will continue, I think, to occupy at least investors' attention for a good sort of year or two again, before we get sort of on top of what it means to go net zero. But that issue is not separated from the social side of things, right? So the just transition aspect is obviously a really good example around how we can't just deal with one sort of environmental issue without also thinking, how that sort of impacts communities and people. When we're thinking about impact bonds, we're also considering co-benefits in terms of social co-benefits from environmental bonds, etc. So when we look at information or engagement with companies, we're looking for reporting, disclosure, and engagement that really is focusing on outcomes. So we've sort of moved away from this stage now where we are presenting commitments, management systems, how much we're all behind all of this, to sort of having an honest conversation about what is actually happening, what can we actually prove. Because ultimately, this, whether it's sustainable development goals or anything else, is what we're going to have to demonstrate. It's all well to sort of tag different SDGs to activities, but I argue that you can take any business and you could probably tag every single SDG to something that's going on in the business, right?
Absolutely,
And there's such enormous sensitivity now for greenwashing in this space that I mean, it's about time that we have that sensitivity. You and I and other people know that over the years we've been able to launch and talk about this in a completely free way without any sort of repercussions or need for demonstrating what's in the products. So I want to highlight two things that is coming our way from a European perspective that's going to be incredibly important. And it's all coming under the EU regulation. One is this notion of double materiality, which has been around for a long time, but we haven't really addressed it, apart from in certain products. And it's the idea that investors need to think about not just what is financially material back into an investment, but also how that investment is material back out to the social or environmental issue. This, I think, creates something to think about from a reporting perspective or for the EHS community in terms of, the focus is not going to be as strict going forward with respect to whether it's the SASB framework or something else, but actually thinking about the whole system of sustainability. That is what investors are going to want to try and understand, and what we have to demonstrate that we understand. So there's something called the principal adverse impacts, which is coming through fast, in the European context, where there's a set of indicators that we need to look for across the board, whether it's material or considered material or not. So I would say staying close to what is expected from a regulatory perspective will be important, because there will be a period of time now where there's a little bit of, it almost feels like it's a dichotomy, really, or maybe feeling even a bit schizophrenic, in the sense that investors have worked long and hard to really try to figure out how this is material to them. And we're now landing on these points about rejecting box ticking. This is not about exclusions. This is, this is really about financing change, etc. But then on the other hand, we're increasingly living in a world where, we are being told what is good and what is bad. So an impact investment, for example, has to pass all these other social tests as well, even if it's an environmental investment. Going back to again what Dan was talking about. So it's changing very quickly. It's very competitive, and I think the information that investors will start looking for from the investments is going to change quite dramatically, which is why I think you'll find that engagement escalating and changing very rapidly.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, that is really interesting. I think the space remains very fast moving and quite dynamic at the moment, so it's quite helpful. And I think for a lot of people kind of steeped in the traditional kind of careers and spaces, it's important to see how their efforts will continue to contribute to this changing space. We've got a little bit of time left, but I'd like to kind of just wrap up with a question, and I'm going to start with you, Dan, first. Just in terms of if you had to sort of look through your crystal ball, and seers are people of immense wisdom and experience, and I think you fall well into that space. What are you seeing over the next 5 years as kind of starting to emerge as the most important kind of issues to be considered through your lens?
Yeah, I think one thing I've learned is looking in my crystal ball. I tend to get it wrong because things shift so quickly in this space. I think if the pandemic has taught us anything, is that things will come along that will change dramatically the way that we focus our attention on it. I do think it's one of the it's pandemic and how we're treating environmental health and safety is probably will be one of the biggest things that will impact the space over the next couple of years, which I think Therese said earlier as well, in terms of how that's there. But I think there will be there will be more focus on this from the commercial sector, but I think we're also going to see more legislation and regulatory pressure on organisations in the EH&S and how that relates to the programs. I don't think greenwashing is going to become even less acceptable than it is today, and I think organisations are going to need to be able to demonstrate that what they are committing to, they actually have a plan to deliver against that, and to be able to leverage the data that they have and technology solutions to help them to implement those programs. So I do think, there will be an increased reliance on sort of digital transformation of this space, taking it away from files at the bottom of people's drawers to systems and processes that can all be rolled back up into effective reporting that shows that organisations are making positive steps and positive impacts against those targets that they have set themselves or are being set by legislation. I think in terms of the broader environmental buckets, I agree with Therese. I think air emissions regulations, greenhouse gas is going to be a major focus with a lot of organisations committing now to science-based targets. We're certainly seeing a lot more of that being publicly reported, and I think that will increase. I think we're going to see consolidation in supply chains, but the complexity of supply chains isn't going to go away. So again, more transparency and the ability to transfer risk and work with supply chains collaboratively on shared initiatives rather than it being very top-down driven. I think it's got to be from both, brands and organizations, but also be supplier facility led in that respect. So I think we'll, again, looking to see how the space can evolve to drive a genuine business case to reducing environmental impact within the supply chain that actually can demonstrate a value to the supply chain themselves rather than simply ticking a box on their customer's spreadsheet. So I think more work in that space we'll definitely see.
Awesome.
And something else will come up that none of us have thought about. That's almost inevitable as well.
I think you're right about that. Therese, just in closing on your thoughts, maybe looking through the investor lens in your sort of like crystal ball for the next 3 to 5 years, what do you see as potentially big shifts from an investor landscape perspective?
Oh gosh, Malcolm, there really is so much. But speaking perhaps a little bit selfishly from the 91 perspective, and this is genuinely also me personally, as someone who's sort of dedicated my career to this, I think the focus needs to be on emerging markets and how we ensure that companies focus not just on sort of the big systems, the big picture bit, but how do we focus on addressing the underserved part of the world in terms of getting them along with us. That is critical for climate change. In fact, if we have any chance at dealing with that, we must bring that along. It comes to the point about the supply chain. It's not going to be enough anymore to just look at that top level activity from a business, but the expectation actually runs very deep going forward on this. So I mean, for me, that's going to be the priority, and hopefully that is as well where the attention is going to be on for the leading companies in the world.